Blessed are you, O Yahweh, our God, King of the universe. Behold, God is my salvation. I will trust and will not be afraid. For Yahweh God is my strength and my song, and he has become my salvation. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation, and you will say in that day, Give thanks to Yahweh, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the peoples, proclaim that his name is exalted.
Welcome back to the Greater Apocalypse, where we dive deep into biblical prophecy and ancient history to uncover the truth about the Messiah. Today, we're examining two powerful chronological anchors in the Gospels that serve as a second and third witness to the dating of Yeshua's baptism between the fall of 27 and the spring of 28. The first chronological anchor is the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, mentioned in Luke 3:1, which dates the start of John the Baptist's ministry, and shortly after, Yeshua's baptism and his public ministry. At first glance, though, there's a big problem. Conventional history says that Tiberius became emperor in 14, making his 15th year fall 2 years later in 29. This 2-year discrepancy would seem to disprove a 27 baptism and a 30 crucifixion, and it would seem to provide evidence for a later crucifixion date. But not so fast. The key here lies in how Luke, writing as a Greek to a Greek audience, dated events. He used the Syro-Macedonian calendar, which makes Tiberius' 15th year align perfectly with Yeshua being, quote, about 30 at his baptism. And this would have happened sometime between the fall of 27 and the spring of 28, just before Passover. Now we're also going to look at why theories of a co-regency with Augustus don't hold up here, and also how a third witness from John 2 shows that the Jews were saying the temple had been under construction for 46 years, further confirming this time frame that we're looking at for Yeshua's first ministry Passover to have been in the spring of 28. So stick around as we unpack these historical and biblical witnesses, harmonizing the timelines, and see how they point to a coherent picture of the Messiah's ministry and crucifixion in 30 CE. If you're ready to challenge some conventional assumptions and strengthen your faith through solid chronology, let's get into it.
And a voice from heaven said, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Matthew 3:17.
Yeshua's baptism and ministry. The second witness, the 15th year of Tiberius. The prophecy of 70 weeks given to Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 asserts that there will be 69 weeks to transpire before the coming of the Messiah. This time period equates to 483 years, and we covered it in detail in the chapter entitled The 70 Weeks of Daniel. In this same presentation, I demonstrated a baptism date for Yeshua between Tishri of 27 CE and Nisan of 28 CE. Here, I aim to present two other witnesses confirming this date. The date of Yeshua's baptism in either late 27 or early 28 is confirmed by Luke 3:1, which dates it to the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Conventionally, Tiberius's reign is said to have been from 14 CE to 37 CE, making the 15th year of his reign in 29 CE. This is arrived at by using accession year dating, meaning that Tiberius's first year is not counted due to it being his year of succession. At first glance, this creates a dilemma because 29 CE is 2 years later than my proposed 27 CE. The resolution is that Tiberius's reign should be counted from 13 CE, not 14, because Luke was using the Syro-Macedonian calendar, which is the same as the Babylonian but uses Greek names essentially, and it begins its year in the lunar month Dios, approximately corresponding to the Julian month of October. His reign should be reckoned from the beginning of that year, using non-accession year dating. When Augustus died on August 19th of 14 CE, he was immediately succeeded by his adopted son Tiberius, as recorded by Tacitus here.
Whatever the fact was, Tiberius, as he was just entering Illyria, was summoned home by an urgent letter from his mother, and it has not been thoroughly ascertained whether at the city of Nola he found Augustus still breathing or quite lifeless. For Livia had surrounded the house and its approaches with a strict watch, and favorable bulletins were published from time to time, till, provision having been made for the demands of the crisis, one and the same report told men that Augustus was dead and that Tiberius Nero was master of the state.
Tiberius's succession was at least 1 month prior to the new year, and his official appointment by the Senate on September 18th of 14 CE also fell before the new year in October. Therefore, Tiberius began his reign in the regnal year corresponding to October of 13 to October of 14. In dating the reigns of kings, both the Romans and the Greeks, or Syro-Macedonians, used non-accession year dating, meaning that the year in which the king takes the throne is considered to be the first year of his reign, regardless of how much of that year had transpired. In other words, partial years are counted. Therefore, the 15th year of Tiberius corresponds to October of 27 to October of 28. Thus, Yeshua's baptism occurred sometime between the fall of 27 and the spring of 28, just before Passover. Kenneth Frank Doig covers this further in his book, New Testament Chronology.
As with his other timed references, Luke, a Greek, was using the Syro-Macedonian calendar familiar to Theophilus, the Greek recipient of his letters in Antioch. This calendar was in use through much of the Middle East, including Judea, and would here be an expected reference. The usual reckoning was by the years of the Syrian Seleucid era, which dated by the Syro-Macedonian calendar. The rulers of that area reckoned their reigns by this calendar. They used inclusive reckoning, with the new year beginning with the fall lunar month of Dios. The dating of the reign of Tiberius can be according to Luke's Syro-Macedonian calendar. Tiberius became Caesar on August 19th of 14 CE, and in that year Dios I fell on October 15th. Thus, his first regnal year according to the Syro-Macedonian calendar would be from Dios I, or October 25th of 13 CE, until October 14th of 14 CE. Luke would have measured the 15 years from that year 1 by non-accession, or inclusive, reckoning. Thus, the 15th year fell from October 20th of 27 CE to October 9th of 28 CE. According to Luke's Syro-Macedonian reckoning, John the Baptist began his ministry between these two dates. This falls in line with the arrival of Pontius Pilate by the autumn of 27 CE. The earliest first Passover of Jesus' ministry would have been in 28 CE.
The co-princeps theory disproven. We've demonstrated that there is no discrepancy between Luke's use of Tiberius's 15th year when we appropriately utilize the Syro-Macedonian calendar and non-accession year dating. Regardless, because of a perceived contradiction with the conventional incorrect dating of Tiberius's 15th year to 29 CE, some have attempted to rectify it by claiming that Luke reckoned the start of his reign from 2 years prior, beginning in either 12 or 13 CE, by including his co-regency with his father Augustus. Now, Josephus certainly did not include the co-regency time in his accounting, and he began his dating with the death of Augustus. Is it then fitting that Luke would break with convention by including Tiberius's time as co-regent? Proposed evidence that Luke's practice may have included Tiberius's time as co-regent is predicated upon the notion that he also recognized Annas and Caiaphas' de facto co-regency in Luke 3:2. High priest Annas was deposed by Valerius Gratus in 15 CE after the death of Annius Rufus, the Roman prefect of Judea, whom Gratus replaced. Caiaphas was not installed as high priest until 3 years after Annas was deposed, in 18 CE. By the way, Pontius Pilate was Gratus' successor 11 years later in 26 CE. And Pontius was governor of Judea from 26 to 36, although Kenneth Doig claims that he was not made governor until the autumn of 27. Annas' high priesthood occurred from 6 to 15 CE, and Caiaphas' high priesthood occurred from 18 to 36 CE. Luke was referring to Caiaphas' time as high priest from 18 to 36, yet he recognized that his father-in-law Annas was advising Caiaphas and essentially running things behind the scenes. So Caiaphas and Annas had a de facto, or in reality, co-regency as high priest, even though Caiaphas was sole high priest by law, or de jure. Because Luke reckoned the de facto reign in this instance, it follows that he may have done the same with Tiberius, who, although was recorded by the Romans to have been made emperor in August of 14, he was given co-princeps authority in either 12 or 13 CE, which would look like this. Tiberius's co-regency begins in 12 or 13 CE, and the 15th year of Tiberius and Yeshua's baptism would occur in 26 or 27 CE. There's a striking difference between the two co-regencies, however. Tiberius was Augustus's clear successor and was granted co-princeps authority by law during Augustus's reign. Caiaphas, by contrast, did not immediately succeed Annas. There was a 3-year gap, and his son Eleazar served as high priest from 16 to 17, in the interim before Caiaphas was made high priest. Because of this, Luke's acknowledgement of Caiaphas's and Annas' co-regency was more likely a practical reference to Annas' involvement rather than an appeal to using co-regencies as a dating methodology. This is further evidenced by the fact that Luke specifically mentions both Caiaphas and Annas together, yet mentions Tiberius alone. If Luke were using co-regencies in dating regnal years, why did he not also include Augustus when he made mention of Tiberius's 15th year? In other words, why didn't Luke say, in the 15th year of the reign of Augustus and Tiberius, like he did when he mentioned the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas? Assuming that one were to accept Tiberius's co-regency as a starting point for his official reign, how then would one determine the correct theoretical regnal date for Tiberius's co-princeps? History records that his co-regency was given to him shortly after his return from war in Germany in 12 CE. Suetonius writes,
After 2 years, he returned to the city from Germania and celebrated the triumph, which he had postponed, accompanied also by his generals, for whom he had obtained the triumphal regalia. Since the consuls caused a law to be passed soon after this that he should govern the provinces jointly with Augustus, and hold the census with him, he set out for Illyricum on the conclusion of the lustral ceremonies, but he was at once recalled, and finding Augustus in his last illness, but still alive, he spent an entire day with him in private.
Rick Lanzer articulates the timing of Tiberius's granting of co-princeps in his paper entitled, What Was the 15th Year of Tiberius?, where he states,
On whole, then, the weight of scholarship seems to favor Suetonius' timeline. Tiberius celebrated his triumph in October AD 12. Co-princeps power was then granted him in the first half of AD 13. The census-taking and lustral ceremonies occupied the latter half of AD 13. Then early AD 14 saw his trip to Illyricum, followed by a quick recall home for Augustus' final illness. Highly respected scholar Theodore Mommsen views the situation that way, noting in A History of Rome under the emperors that, only months prior to the death of Augustus, the same powers that were invested in the emperor were conferred on him in all the provinces. Only months prior implies less than a year, seemingly making AD 12 too early. What we may take away from these co-princeps details, considered together with Luke's pragmatic attitude toward the high priesthood of Annas, is that Luke may well have regarded the first year of Tiberius, so far as Judea was concerned, as beginning in AD 13. By inclusive reckoning, this would assign the 15th year of Tiberius, when the ministry of John the Baptist began, to AD 27.
Tiberius was officially confirmed by the Roman Senate on September 18, 14 CE. At that time, he was given the titles of Augustus and Pater Patrei. If only months transpired between Tiberius's co-princeps and Augustus's death, then it's most likely Tiberius was given co-princeps in 13 CE, and not 12 CE as some have suggested. The earliest coin that I am aware of displaying Tiberius's co-princeps with Augustus was likely minted in 13 CE. Although we may establish that Tiberius's co-regency began in 13 CE, we must determine when it may have been legally reckoned. Because the Romans and Greeks used non-accession dating, Tiberius's first year was whatever calendar year it was at the time, and not post-dated. The title co-princeps entitled Tiberius to a power equal to Augustus. Therefore, it could be said that he reigned during his time as co-princeps. C. Velleius Paterculus in the Roman History says,
Tiberius showed the same valor, and was attended by the same fortune, when he entered Germany on his later campaigns as in his first. After he had broken the force of the enemy by his expeditions on sea and land, had completed his difficult task in Gaul, and had settled by restraint rather than by punishment the dissensions that had broken out among the Viennenses, at the request of his father that he should have in all the provinces and armies a power equal to his own, the Senate and Roman people so decreed. For indeed it was incongruous that the provinces which were being defended by him should not be under his jurisdiction, and that he who was foremost in bearing aid should not be considered an equal in the honor to be won. On his return to the city he celebrated the triumph over the Pannonians and Dalmatians, long since due him, but postponed by reason of a succession of wars.
It does not follow, however, that Tiberius's time as co-princeps serves as the appropriate method of reckoning his regnal date. To be thorough, however, we will follow this line of thinking and see that, based upon which regnal dating convention is used, his co-princeps could be reckoned from either 12 or 13 CE. We'll work from the assumption that he was granted co-princeps in the first half of Julian 13 CE. We must acknowledge that there were at least 4 calendars Luke could have chosen to work from, and each had a different regnal new year. In addition, we must consider that debate exists as to whether Luke would have counted Tiberius's partial year as his first year, or non-accession reckoning. Or would he have considered his first year as beginning on the New Year's Day following, which is accession reckoning. This chart sums it up nicely. Here are the regnal dating conventions for a theoretical Tiberius co-regency. The Jewish religious calendar has a New Year date of Nisan 1 in the spring. Using non-accession regnal date would be 12 or 13 CE, and using an accession regnal date would be 13 or 14. The Roman calendar's New Year is January 1st in the winter, non-accession at 13, accession at 14. Syro-Macedonian New Year at Dios 1, which is in the fall, non-accession 12, accession 13. And the Jewish civil calendar has a New Year date in Tishri 1, which is in the fall, non-accession being 12 CE, and accession regnal date would be 13 CE. Did Luke count the start of the reign using the Roman calendar of January 1st, the Syro-Macedonian calendar of Dios 1st in October, the Jewish religious calendar of Nisan 1 in approximately March or April, or the Jewish civil calendar of Tishri 1 around September? As referenced before, there is evidence to suggest that Luke was using the Syro-Macedonian or Greek calendar as it pertains to regnal dating. This calendar recognizes the new year during the fall lunar month of Dios in October. So if Tiberius began co-princeps in the first half of 13 CE, then his first year is from October of 12 CE to October of 13 CE, using the Syro-Macedonian New Year. Using non-accession dating, this would place his 15th year beginning in the fall of 26 and ending in the fall of 27, likely 1 year too short. It is my opinion that the Syro-Macedonian calendar or the Jewish civil calendar, which both utilize an autumn new year, are the most likely candidates for what Luke would have used. Kenneth Doig expounds.
What calendar system would be used by Luke? Luke was a Greek from Antioch, and he wrote his gospel to Theophilus, another Greek in Antioch. The calendar system in use there was the Syro-Macedonian calendar, introduced by Alexander the Great over 3 centuries earlier. This calendar was the basis of the Seleucid era, the standard for dating throughout the Middle East for many centuries. This calendar was likely that used by the Herods and other Eastern rulers for one method of dating their reigns. This Syro-Macedonian calendar is the expected reference by Luke. In this calendar system the new year began in the fall month of Dios, and the 6th month was Xanthikos. Some suggest that Theophilus was a Roman rather than a Greek, and that Luke would have used Roman dating from January. This is based solely on the term of address that Luke used once in his opening to Theophilus, most excellent. This wording was also used when Lysias wrote to the Roman governor Felix and when Paul addressed Felix and the later Roman governor, Festus. It is then implied that this term of address was only applicable when speaking to a Roman, that Theophilus must be a Roman and that Luke must be using Roman dating. However, this ignores Theophilus' Greek name, Greek city of Antioch, and Greek friend, Luke. Also, it has not been demonstrated that Luke addressed a Roman as most excellent. He was only reporting the words of the Roman citizens Lysias and Paul when they addressed Romans. Most excellent was likely a term of official respect and not an ethnic term reserved for Romans. The use of Roman dating by Luke is not supported by any other scriptural reference.
Josephus made frequent reference to the Syro-Macedonian calendar as well. Concerning the flood, he wrote,
This calamity happened in the 600th year of Noah's government, in the 2nd month, called by the Macedonians Dios, but by the Hebrews Marheshkan. For so did they order their year in Egypt. But Moses appointed that Nisan, which is the same with Xanthicus, should be the 1st month for their festivals, because he brought them out of Egypt in that month. So that this month began the year as to all the solemnities they observed to the honor of God, although he preserved the original order of the months, as to selling and buying and other ordinary affairs.
By concluding that Luke was likely using the Syro-Macedonian calendar, or possibly the Jewish civil calendar, and not the Roman or Jewish religious calendar, we must conclude that Tiberius's first year was either in 12 CE according to his co-regency, or in 13 CE according to his succession to the throne and confirmation by the Senate. In conclusion, Luke dated Tiberius's first year in 13 CE, using the non-accession dating system and the Syro-Macedonian calendar. Thus, his 15th year began in the fall of 27 CE and ended in the fall of 28 CE. As was stated from the start, there is no need, nor is there adequate evidence, to suggest that Tiberius's regnal year was reckoned from his co-regency. Therefore, 13 CE is the appropriate choice. We know that Yeshua's ministry began sometime before Passover, according to John 2:11 and 13. Therefore, it must have begun prior to the spring of 28 CE, but after October of 27. If Yeshua was born on Tishri 1 of 3 BCE, then he would have just turned 29 years old in the fall of 27. Therefore, at his baptism, he would be, quote, about 30, according to Luke 3:23, occurring sometime just before Passover. Now, later on, in a segment where I talk about the length of Messiah's ministry, I document some evidence that points to his baptism having occurred in potentially January or February of 28, and still within Tiberius's 15th year, but we'll get to that possibility later. It should be noted here that those who propose a 33 CE crucifixion do so using a 14 CE succession date for Tiberius. They're using a Roman calendar beginning in January, with his first year corresponding to January of 14 CE, rather than using the Syro-Macedonian reckoning of October of 13 CE. And they don't count as succession year, so they're using accession year dating. And this places his 15th year in 29 CE. They then utilize a 3.5-year ministry timeline for Yeshua, placing his crucifixion in 33 CE. So, the insistence upon accession year dating and the use of a Roman calendar is likely not based upon historical evidence, but it's predicated upon a prejudice toward a 33 CE crucifixion date, in my opinion. The third witness, 46 years of temple building. We have a third witness to a fall of 27 CE to spring of 28 CE ministry start date found in John 2:19-21, where just before the first Passover of Yeshua's ministry, the Jews tell Yeshua that the temple had been being built for the past 46 years.
The Jews were saying to him, "For 46 years this temple has been being built, and will you raise it in 3 days?" John 2:20.
We can use what the Pharisees said concerning how long the temple had been being built to determine what year it was by counting forward 46 years from the beginning of the construction of Herod's temple. This will arrive at the year of Yeshua's first ministry Passover. Because they state that it had, quote, been being built for 46 years, we must count these years as elapsed time using non-inclusive reckoning, meaning we aren't counting inclusively like we may count partial years in regnal counting. In other words, we must count like we're counting birthdays. So what time of year did Herod's construction begin? From the time that Herod began construction on the temple, it became operational in 1 year and 6 months, upon which time a great celebration was held with many sacrifices. Josephus records that this occurred on the anniversary of the king's inauguration. This discussion takes us all the way back to the 2 chronological views of Herod's life. Do you remember in a previous video we discussed the minority view versus the consensus view? Well, we're going to look at those 2 views again here. So you might want to go back 2 videos and brush up on that history where we talk about the death of Herod and the chronology surrounding that. So with that said, If Herod was inaugurated in the late fall using the minority view, then construction must have begun in late spring. If his inauguration was in the spring using the consensus view, then construction must have begun in the fall. Josephus records,
But the temple itself was built by the priests in a year and 6 months, upon which all the people were full of joy, and presently they returned thanks in the first place to God, and in the next place for the alacrity the king had showed. They feasted and celebrated this rebuilding of the temple. And for the king he sacrificed 300 oxen to God, as did the rest every one according to his ability, the number of which sacrifices is not possible to set down, for it cannot be that we should truly relate it. For at the same time with this celebration for the work about the temple fell also the day of the king's inauguration, which he kept of an old custom as a festival, and it now coincided with the other, which coincidence of them both made the festival most illustrious.
This links the construction date to the time of year corresponding to 6 months from Herod's inauguration date. This should be understood to be referring to his initial de jure inauguration date, which then places construction beginning in the 18th year of Herod's de jure reign, likely in late spring or early summer of that year. Josephus gives 2 dating schemas for the year of Herod's reign in which construction began on the temple. The first is a 15-year dating schema, and the second is an 18-year. The 15-year schema is found in Wars of the Jews, and the 18-year schema is found in Antiquities of the Jews. It's important to point out that each of these accounts are using different start dates for their respective 15 years and 18 years. But there is debate around that, and I'm going to explain that. The 15-year accounting in Wars of the Jews says,
Accordingly, in the 15th year of his reign, Herod rebuilt the temple.
Now this should be understood to be referring to the 15th year since Herod was made de facto king of Judea, because it is mentioned just after Josephus recounts the story of Herod's siege of Jerusalem and Caesar crowning him king of Judea. The other account of 18 years is found in Antiquities of the Jews, and it says,
And now Herod, in the 18th year of his reign, and after the acts already mentioned, undertook a very great work, that is, to build of himself the temple of God.
This should be understood to be referring to the 18th year since Herod was made de jure or legal king of Judea. And so there is an appropriate 3-year gap between the 2 dating schemas. Now here's where we run into some trouble. We're going to compare and contrast the 2 views, the consensus view and the minority view, and see where each perspective gets some things right and some things wrong. And then I'll provide what I think to be the correct perspective. The consensus view interprets Josephus to have been referring to Herod's de facto year in both Antiquities of the Jews and Wars of the Jews. And this view counts 18 years forward to arrive at the start date for construction of the temple. They reckon Herod's first de facto official year beginning in 37 N, and using the 18th year of his reign figure, they arrive at 20 N as the year that construction began. Because according to this view, the construction must have begun in the fall, they establish fall of 20 BCE as the temple construction start date. This places the 46th anniversary of the temple construction to have occurred in the time spanning from fall of 27 to fall of 28 CE. Yeshua's conversation with the Pharisees then occurred just before Passover in 28. Using a 2.5-year ministry, the crucifixion then occurred in 30 CE. and this would seem to fit my hypothesis well, except for the fact that they are fully relying on a supposition that Josephus made an error. Proponents of the consensus view assert that Josephus's mention of the 15th year of Herod's reign in Wars of the Jews was a transcription error and should read 18th year in both Antiquities of the Jews and Wars of the Jews. In my opinion, the consensus view may have wrongly applied the 18-year figure to Herod's de facto reign mentioned in Wars of the Jews, and to be consistent should rather have placed construction to have begun in the year beginning on Nisan 1 of 23 BCE, or 23N, and using the 15-year figure that is recorded by Josephus. But this would correspond to a construction start date in the fall of 23 BCE on Tishri 1, and this correction would place Yeshua's first ministry Passover in 25 CE and the crucifixion in 27, which contradicts their own findings from Antiquities of the Jews, and certainly doesn't fit my hypothesis nor a 30 CE crucifixion date. But the consensus view proponents have to rely upon this because they're thinking that the 15th year figure should be used in both accounts. The minority view reckons Herod's de facto accession year in 36 T, with his first official year beginning in Tishri of 35 BCE. The 15th year of his reign would then begin on Tishri 1 of 21 BCE. Herod's original de jure inauguration date in 39 BCE is placed in the late fall, making his accession year 39 T and his first regnal year 38 T. The inauguration by the Senate occurred certainly no sooner than Tishri 1, but more likely no sooner than Tishri 13, based upon an Aphrodisias inscription of a decree by the Roman Senate dated to Tishri 13, demonstrating that the Senate was in session at that time. Currently, Tishri 13 is the best fit for his inauguration date based upon the evidence available. Because Josephus links the construction start date to the time of year corresponding to 6 months from Herod's inauguration date, we can establish Nisan 13 in late spring and possibly even later into early summer as the temple construction start date. The minority view is able to harmonize both of Josephus's references to the construction start having occurred in both Herod's 18th and 15th year. This is simply because, in Antiquities, he was referring to his de jure status as king in 39 T, whilst in Wars he was referring to his de facto king status in 36 T. Thus, the 3-year difference between the accounts is accounted for. Because the minority view uses accession year dating, the first year is not included when the years of his reign are counted. Therefore, Herod's 15th and 18th year begins in 21 T. This aligns with Herod's temple construction project beginning on Nisan 13 of 20 BCE. Now, I do believe there is a significant problem with how proponents of this view interpret their data in relation to the timing of Yeshua's ministry. Proponents of the minority view acknowledge 21 T BCE as the 18th year of his reign. It follows, then, that the 46 years of temple building starting from the following spring would place the 46th anniversary spanning from Nisan 13 of 27 to Nisan 13 of 28. Thus, Yeshua's conversation with the Pharisees occurred in 28 CE prior to Nisan 13. The problem here for the minority view proponents is that they claim that this conversation with the Pharisees occurred not in 28, but in 30 CE, and that the crucifixion took place in 33 CE. To account for this, the claim is made by some that the Pharisees were making reference not to the construction of the temple as a whole, but specifically to the sacred edifice of the temple, meaning the holy place or sanctuary having stood for 46 years. The sacred edifice was completed a year and a half after construction began, which would be Tishri 13 of 19 BCE. And 46 years forward from this date arrives at 28 CE, meaning the 46th anniversary of the sacred edifice spanned from Tishri 13 of 28 to Tishri 13 of 29. This would place the conversation with the Pharisees in the spring of 29 CE, but this is still 1 year too short. But if one assumes that the temple construction occurred in the fall, then the 46th anniversary can be stretched out to the period spanning from Nisan 13 of 29 to Nisan 13 of 30 CE. And that is how the minority view proponents are able to take their chronology and artificially stretch it out to fit a 33 CE crucifixion. Rick Lanzer points out the position of those holding to the minority view, where he quotes Dwight Pentecost's claim in The Words and Works of Jesus Christ, where he says,
Joseph Blinzler feels that AD 28, as marking the commencement of Christ's ministry, is substantiated by John 2 verse 20, where the Jews state that the temple had been in continuous construction for 46 years since Herod began to build it in 20 to 19 BC. But the Jews are talking about the temple edifice, which was completed in 18 to 17 BC, as having stood for 46 years, that is, the Passover of AD 30, rather than the temple precinct, which was still in the building process.
Now, applying a 3+ year ministry with a total of 4 ministry Passovers to Yeshua's ministry, it then places the crucifixion in 33 CE. This interpretation, however, is unnatural to the reading of both Josephus and John 2:19-21. It also contradicts the minority view's assertion that Herod's inauguration occurred in the fall. So, both views have to rely upon internal inconsistencies or contradictions to truly make their chronologies fit. The minority view should be corrected to reflect the 46th anniversary of the actual start date of the temple construction on Nisan 13 of 20 BCE, rather than a forced reference to the completion of the sacred edifice and its preservation for 46 years. This correction places the 46th anniversary from Nisan 13 of 27 to Nisan 13 of 28, and it places Yeshua's conversation with the Pharisees occurring just a few days before Passover in 28 CE, likely between the 10th and 12th of Nisan. Let's take a look at a chart to summarize this information and the corrections that I propose these two chronologies should have employed in order to be consistent. Consensus versus minority chronology, Herod to crucifixion. So the consensus places Herod's first year in 37N, while the minority places it in 35T. Consensus places temple construction to have begun in the 18th year of his de facto reign, which they state was 20N in the fall. But if we're going to be consistent and not rely upon the supposition that there was a transcription error in Josephus's words, we have to correct this date to 23N in the fall. And so then this would place the 46th anniversary of temple construction in the fall of 27 to 28 is what they state, but the corrected position would then be 24 to 25, which we know really does not work. Now, this would place Yeshua's first ministry Passover when the Pharisees tell him 46 years of building had transpired. As they say, it would be in 28 CE, but using the corrected chronology in their own version, you'd have to say 25 CE. And then this would place the crucifixion in 27 instead of in 30 CE as they state. But let's take a look at the minority view. The minority places Herod's first year in 35T and says that the temple construction began in the 15th year of his de facto reign, which is correct. It did begin in the 15th year of his de facto reign. And they make this to be 21T, in the fall of 20 BCE, as they state. But they have to stretch this out to the spring of 20 BCE, contradicting their own chronology. See, the minority proponents state that the temple construction began in Herod's 15th year, which they reckon is 21T, and Josephus says that construction began 6 months after Herod's inauguration anniversary, meaning that construction began in the spring of 20 BCE. But minority proponents who embrace a 33 crucifixion date are forced to be inconsistent and place the temple construction in the fall of 20 BCE. So then that takes us to the 46th anniversary of temple construction. And this would have occurred in the late spring or summer of, they state, 29 to 30. But if we're going to be consistent, we have to say that this really was 27 to 28. This then takes us to Yeshua's first ministry Passover, when the Pharisees tell him that 46 years of building the temple had transpired, and the minority view states this occurred in 30 CE. But if we're being consistent, we have to say this must have occurred in 28 CE. This takes us to the crucifixion date, which they state occurs in 33 CE, but this is relying upon changing the date of Herod's inauguration from the fall to the spring, and it relies upon pushing out Yeshua's ministry all the way to 3.5 years with 4 Passovers, which are not recorded, and it relies upon this idea that the temple construction referred not to the temple itself, but only the sacred edifice of the temple, which is not found in the text. Therefore, if we're going to be consistent, we have to say that the crucifixion occurred in 30 CE using the minority view chronology. The minority view appears to have correctly interpreted Herod's 18th year from Antiquities of the Jews to have referred to his de jure reign, and places its beginning in Tishri of 21 BCE, consistent with his 15th year of his de facto reign from War of the Jews. The consensus view appears to have correctly interpreted the 46 years of temple construction to have referred to its initial construction, rather than a contrived reference to only years in which the temple edifice stood. By utilizing the minority view's chronology of Herod and the consensus view's interpretation of 46 years of building the temple, we arrive at a harmonization that incorporates the strongest evidence from both. Counting 46 years of temple construction from Nisan 13 of 20 BCE, we arrive at Nisan 13 of 27 CE. From this date until the following year, Nisan 13 of 28, the temple would have been considered to have been under construction for 46 years. When the Pharisees told Yeshua the temple had been under construction for 46 years, they said this prior to Passover. Yeshua had arrived when Passover was near, and on the same day he entered the courts. I suggest this day was the 10th of Nisan, which is Lamb Selection Day. He would have arrived no later than this date so that he could procure a lamb for Passover, and the text naturally reads that his conversation with the Pharisees occurred on the same day. This would then fall at least 3 days prior to the completion of 47 years of temple building. Therefore, it follows that the year Yeshua had this conversation was 28 CE, just before the 47th anniversary of the temple's construction start date. Because Yeshua's conversation with the Pharisees took place in 28 CE before Passover, and we know that his ministry had already begun, we can confirm once more that Yeshua's baptism occurred within the time frame of fall of 27 to spring of 28 CE. I believe the 70th and final week of Daniel chapter 9 began in the fall of 26 CE. Yeshua's ministry began the following year, sometime after the fall of 27 CE, and perhaps as late as January or February of 28, leading up to his first ministry Passover in the spring of 28. His third ministry Passover, 2 years later, places his crucifixion in 30 CE. Now that we've encountered 3 scripturally based and historically verified witnesses to Yeshua's first Passover occurring in 28 CE, we can begin to see how the timing of his crucifixion is coming into view, and we must scrutinize the various theories surrounding the length of his ministry and the Passion Week. In the next episode, we will discuss the actual length of Yeshua's ministry, demonstrating the errors of both a 3.5-year ministry and a 1-year ministry, and showing how his approximate 2.5-year ministry points directly to a 30 CE crucifixion, lining up with Yeshua being, quote, about 30 at his baptism. So join me as we discover more about the historical fulfillment of the coming of Messiah the Prince. Shalom!